Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be focusing in on the National Education Policy of 2020, or as most people call it, NEP 2020.
Mm.
But more specifically, we are going to zoom in on the language aspect of this whole thing. Now, you've mentioned before that you want to, really get a good grasp on this without getting bogged down, so we've rounded up a really interesting bunch of sources to help us do just that.
Yeah, we're kind of on a mission today, aren't we? We're going to try and sort through some of the really big questions surrounding this policy, and who knows, we might even uncover some surprises along the way.
I think so too. So today we're going to be talking about a few things like if Tamil is, arguably one of the oldest languages, why isn't it taught all over India? What would even make people in the north interested in learning it?
Yeah, that's a good one. We'll also get into the whole practical side of things, like whether schools can actually find enough teachers for all 22 official languages that the NEP talks about.
Right, because that's a lot of teachers. Also, we'll tackle the question of why, if Hindi is already so widely spoken in the north, should people in other parts of India have to learn it just to communicate?
Definitely. We'll look at that. And speaking of regions, we should also think about whether it even makes sense to promote Hindi in some areas, especially when states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh are already having trouble with their own language education.
It's all connected, isn't it? And then, of course, there's the big one. The impact of all this on other languages. Could the push for Hindi actually be, squeezing out other languages in India?
Some sensitive stuff there. So to help us get our heads around all of this, we've brought in a real mix of sources. We have insights from some YouTube channels like Duolingo, which is all about the Tamil language, and we'll be looking at Beer Biceps, where they actually had a historian talking about ancient Tamil Nadu. It's fascinating stuff.
Oh, and don't forget the news coverage. We have clips from the Deshbakt, India Today, and NDTV, all covering the recent debates and the whole controversy surrounding the NEP's language policy. We also have these articles from Sabring India and Mint that break down this three-language formula and Tamil Nadu's, shall we say, less than enthusiastic response to it.
Right. They haven't been shy about sharing their opinions, so are you ready to get stuck in?
Let's do it. I think one of the most important things to understand about the NEP 2020 is this concept of a three-language formula for schools all across India. This has been, as you can imagine, a pretty big talking point.
Oh, yeah, especially in the South. Tamil Nadu, in particular, has been very vocal in their opposition to this whole three-language approach. They're currently led by the DMK government, and they see it as a way of imposing Hindi on areas where it's not the main language.
Makes sense, and they've been quite clear about it, too. Chief Minister Stalin has called the policy, and I quote, poisonous and toxic. It's pretty strong language.
Yeah, you say that again. We saw that in the India Today report, right?
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting is Tamil Nadu is sticking firmly to their current two-language policy, which focuses on Tamil and English.
It seems this isn't some new fad for them either.
No, not at all. Sabring India pointed out that this resistance to the three-language formula actually goes way back, like even before 1967. So this is a long-running issue.
Deeply rooted.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the Union Education Minister, Dharmendra Pradhan, he's been trying to, reassure everyone that the NEP isn't about forcing Hindi on anyone. He says all Indian languages are equally important.
Right, we saw that in India Today.
Right. But it seems these reassurances haven't really eased all the concerns in Tamil Nadu.
Especially since the policy is coming from the BJP, the party currently in power at the center. It creates a lot of distrust, doesn't it?
For sure. It gets even more interesting when you consider that even a spokesperson for the PMK, which is an ally of the BJP, came out and said that a three-language policy isn't even necessary. They said sticking with one or two languages makes more sense.
It's interesting how we see different opinions even within parties that are supposed to be on the same page.
Absolutely. And then there's this whole issue of funding. Sabring India reported that the central government held back a significant amount of education funds from Tamil Nadu.
Oh, wow. How much are we talking?
Initially, it was reported as around 573 crore, but later reports put it much higher, at 2,552 crore. And some people are linking this to Tamil Nadu's reluctance to accept the NEP's language policy.
Oh, that's a lot of money. Do we know what happened to the funds?
Well, Tamil Nadu's finance minister has said that the state has had to use its own money to cover this shortfall.
That's tough.
Yeah, it is. And according to Sabring India again, Tamil Nadu's education minister has accused the union government of basically using this funding as a way to pressure them into adopting the NEP's language proposals.
So it's like they're saying, accept our policy or you don't get the money.
It seems like it, doesn't it? This whole situation really highlights the complexities of India's federal system, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sabrin Gindia reminded us that education is a concurrent subject, meaning both the central and state governments have the power to make laws about it.
Right, and that can obviously lead to, shall we say, disagreements.
Exactly. And this brings us to a really interesting point, which is the age of the Tamil language. Now, while our sources didn't include that specific quote from Prime Minister Modi calling it the oldest, its ancient origins are definitely a topic of discussion.
It makes you wonder, right? If Tamil is so old and historically significant, why isn't it a mandatory subject across all of India? And what could be attracting people in the north to learn it?
That's a great question. What did you find out?
Well, we learned from the Jalingo video that Tamil is spoken by around 70 million people, mainly in Tamil Nadu, Puducherry, Sri Lanka, and Singapore. And it has this really unique grammatical structure.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Well, Julie described it as an agglutinative language, which means you build words by adding suffixes, kind of like snapping together Lego brick.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. It also uses a subject-object-verb word order and has a complex system of cases, which is quite different from many other languages.
That's fascinating. And then there's that episode from Beer Biceps with the historian Malavika Binny. She painted this vivid picture of the history of Tamil Nadu, talking about things like archaeological evidence of megalithic culture that dates back an incredible 12,000 years.
And she also talked about a flourishing, rich and deep cultural heritage that's intertwined with the Tamil language.
So, given all of that, why not make Tamil a national language?
Well, while its historical and cultural significance are undeniable, making it mandatory nationwide is a massive task. You'd have to consider India's incredible linguistic diversity, the unique histories of different regions, and most importantly, the autonomy that states have in shaping their own education policies.
That's a really important point about autonomy. And what about the North? What could be driving their interest in Tamil?
Well, our sources didn't explicitly address that, but we can speculate. The appreciation for its historical and cultural roots is likely a big draw. As Malavika Binny pointed out, there's a growing recognition that we need to better represent South Indian history in our national narratives. So learning Tamil could be driven by academic curiosity, research interests, or simply a desire to connect with that rich heritage.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the NEP's aim of having all 22 official languages represented in schools. This seems like a logistical nightmare, right?
Oh, absolutely. Our sources didn't provide a definite answer on whether this is even feasible. However, a clip we saw from Nirtharai featuring a Tamil Nadu minister, PTR, gave us some insight.
And who is PTR?
PTR is Palanival Tiagradan. Anyway, he talked about how difficult it was for Tamil Nadu to even find qualified teachers for Hindi and English back in the 1960s and 80s when a three-language policy was last considered.
So if they struggled back then with just 2 additional languages, imagine the challenge of finding enough teachers for 22 languages across the entire country.
It makes you wonder about the practicality of this aspect of the NEP, doesn't it?
For sure. Now, this leads us to another major point of contention. If North India predominantly prefers and uses Hindi, why should people in other parts of the country have to learn it just for basic communication?
It's a key argument for those opposed to what they see as Hindi imposition. As we saw in the various news debates, opponents argue that it creates an uneven playing field, giving native Hindi speakers an unfair advantage.
And they also say it can make those who don't speak Hindi feel like they're somehow less Indian, like second-class citizens. The DMK spokesperson in the NDTV debate really drove that point home.
Right, he even described it as a fight against linguistic hegemony, didn't he?
He did. And then there's the argument that English already serves as a common language, especially in fields like business and technology. The DMK spokesperson in the India Today debate actually highlighted how India's economic success is partly due to the widespread use of English. So why push Hindi when there's already an established alternative?
It's a valid point. Of course, those who support the NEP's language policy, like the BJP spokesperson in the India Today debate, point out that Hindi is a widely spoken language in India, so knowing it can open up better communication within the country.
But that's coming from someone who is, in favor of implementing the policy.
True. But at the heart of this debate, it seems there's a real tension between promoting a shared language for national unity and respecting and preserving the incredible linguistic diversity and distinct regional identities that make India so unique.
It's a balancing act that India's been grappling with for a long time, as those NDTV discussions showed us. It goes all the way back to those pre-independence language movements. It's really fascinating.
It is. And it brings us to another important point that you mentioned earlier. If states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh are already struggling to provide quality education even in their primary languages, should the central government be so focused on promoting Hindi in other areas?
Minister PTR, in that near-threat clip, really brought that to light. He talked about the educational challenges and high dropout rates in Bihar, for instance.
And the argument from leaders in Tamil Nadu is that perhaps the focus should be on strengthening basic education in states where it's really needed. They're questioning why the central government isn't prioritizing literacy and addressing those high dropout rates instead of pushing a language policy that faces so much resistance.
So it's about resource allocation and maybe misplaced priorities.
Potentially. It's something to think about, for sure. Now, this brings us to another sensitive topic, which is the worry that pushing Hindi might actually harm other languages in India.
This seems to be a core concern for those who oppose the NEP's language policies. Now, to be clear, our sources didn't directly state that Hindi is currently destroying other languages.
Right, there wasn't any hard evidence of that.
However, the strong opposition to what's seen as Hindi imposition, especially in Tamil Nadu, which we saw in sources like Sabang India, Mint, and those news debates, definitely points to a deep-seated fear. They're worried that giving Hindi too much importance or forcing it on people could lead to the marginalization and eventually the decline of Tamil language and culture.
It's understandable, right? When you look at the history of language politics and the importance of preserving linguistic identity, any perceived threat to Tamil is going to be met with resistance.
One of the NDTV debates actually mentioned that more students in CBSE schools in Tamil Nadu, even those run by DMK leaders, are choosing to learn Hindi. This doesn't automatically mean the death of Tamil, of course, but it could be a sign of a slow shift in language preferences, perhaps driven by a belief that Hindi offers better educational or career opportunities.
Right, so while the evidence of Hindi actively destroying other languages is debatable, the anxieties and fears surrounding the potential negative consequences are very real.
Absolutely. And we can't ignore the fact that this whole language debate is heavily influenced by politics. Every source we looked at, from India Today and NDTV to the Deshbhakt, showed us that language is a political battleground, especially with elections looming in Tamil Nadu.
It's like everyone is accusing everyone else of using the language issue for their own political game.
Exactly. Representatives of the central government claim that the DMK is intentionally creating controversy for political mileage.
And then the DMK and their allies turn around and accuse the BJP of having a hidden agenda of Hindi imposition as part of some grand plan for political dominance.
And some analysts even suggest that the DMK might be using this to solidify their own support base in Tamil Nadu. It's a tangled web, isn't it?
It really is. But it shows how language policy in India is far more than just an educational matter. It's deeply intertwined with power dynamics and political maneuvering.
Okay, so what does all this mean for you, the listener?
Well, the big takeaway here is that the NEP's three-language formula is not a simple educational guideline. It's a complex issue wrapped up in historical sensitivities, cultural identity, the delicate balance of power in a federal system, and even financial considerations.
Right, it's not just about learning a language, it's about so much more.
Exactly. And you've now had a good look at the different sides of this debate, from the incredible history of Tamil to the practical challenges of implementing a multilingual education policy, all while navigating the undercurrents of politics.
It's important to remember that while it often seems like a battle between Hindi and other languages, for many people in Tamil Nadu, it's really about autonomy and resisting any attempt to impose something from the outside, no matter what language it is.
It's about self-determination and protecting what's important to them. Precisely. So what does this all mean for your understanding of India's linguistic landscape and how education policy is shaped? Well, it highlights the complexities of a diverse nation trying to find a balance between unity and the preservation of its many identities. It raises big questions about how national goals can be achieved while respecting regional aspirations and recognizing the powerful role language plays in shaping both.
It's an ongoing conversation, isn't it? And one that everyone should be a part of.
Absolutely. And if you want to delve deeper into this, I'd recommend exploring the history of language movements in India, especially in Tamil Nadu. Understanding the historical context can really shed light on the current debates and maybe even offer insights into potential solutions.
Great suggestion. So until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming.
And most importantly, keep an open mind.
Absolutely.